Hi everyone, my name is Lucy. I'm a 20th century girl living the typical 21st century and maybe beyond life. Always online, always plugged in, sharing the joys, sorrows, and those emotions in between with friends from Chicago, California to Ireland and beyond. All these connections are real and valid, and I am grateful to live in a time where such connection is possible. However, I knew I needed a place disconnected from the online world to connect with people where I was free to be me, a queer POC trans woman who identifies as agnostic but isn't really quite sure, to be honest, about belief or unbelief, hence the whole agnostic thing. Before making my journey to Fourth U, I spoke to my friends about my interest in finding spiritual and physical community. I talked with them about my hopes, desires, and my anxieties. I felt uneasy, partly due to the fact that the only frame of reference I had were the negative examples of the times where communities of faith haven't been so welcoming to people like me. I didn't really know much about Fourth U or UUs, just what the internet had told me. Even now, I feel I have much to learn. Out of what I did learn, I found myself interested in a community without a creed, unified in a search for truth and being compassionate. One of the recurring topics, though, which kept me hesitant and that kept coming up, and I now have experienced firsthand, is the fact that Unitarian Universalism is overwhelmingly white. To be honest, previously, my younger self would have been dismissive of a POC only space. I guess it would have had to do with not having understood the need for such a space. As I've gotten older, though, I recognize the value in a POC only space. It was not until my college years at SUNY Plattsburgh where I felt lonely and isolated, not just being away from home, but the fact that there weren't many people who could relate to my experience of being a POC from the Bronx. A number of times I was the only POC in my class. One occasion where this became uncomfortable for me, and that I still remember years later, was in one class where the majority of other students thought that race had no role to play in environmental justice and environmental activism, a statement which is just plain wrong. I didn't feel comfortable or confident in addressing their misinformation. In all that time, there were few to share and connect with on shared experiences and culture. A lot of days I felt unsatisfied, not just with the less than stellar food quality, but an absence of foods I was familiar with. The few times I did experience food of familiarity, the excitement soon turned to disappointment due to the aforementioned quality. Now I feel fortunate to have come to a Fourth U during the summer and lucky to not have known a Fourth U without a POC only space. I felt more comfortable and confident knowing that there would be others like me and I wouldn't be the only person of color in a sea of whiteness. Being a part of the group is being a part of something greater than myself. Navigating in an overwhelming white space can be a tiresome and exhausting experience. Oftentimes, it is a feeling of seeming out of place or being in the background. For me, the POC group is a time to feel in the foreground, a place to offer and give support. There are very few times and places where POC can exist authentically and fully open with their experiences. It makes me both happy to work with and be a part of a diverse group in the task of continuing to grow this space both for ourselves and for those yet to arrive, whether it be next week, in a month, a year, or whenever. I have not been attending for long, but coming here to this space is part of my week that I look forward to, whether it be gathering with other young adults for brunch, marching with people in our congregation to do climate justice or other forms of activism, or gathering at the back of the sanctuary to talk about the big questions like our respective life philosophies or the small questions, such as plans for the upcoming week. For me, it is and was important to find a place where I can be myself truly, where I can bring my experiences, the good, the bad, and the uncategorizable of being a trans woman of color. This is my space both as an individual and for those like me.
A free and responsible search for truth and meaning. This is the fourth principle of the 7 Unitarian Universalist guiding principles. One of the questions I was asked as a teenager during coming of age in the Unitarian Universalist faith was, which of the 7 UU principles do you feel most connected to? I connected with a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. This principle also helped me put together my identity, particularly my racial identity. I discovered the meaning of race was dependent on who I was talking to, and the truth about race is that it's a social construct. Knowing this does not change the fact that it has had a really, really deep impact on my life. My mother is an immigrant from the South Pacific with Dutch heritage. She has fair skin, blonde hair, and blue eyes. My father was raised in a Caribbean island that was part of US territory, not making him much less of an immigrant. He has dark skin, curly black hair, and dark eyes. It was difficult for both of them to gain employment in New York. For my mom, it was often her gender that created boundaries. For my father, it was often his race, which inhibited his opportunities. They instilled in me the spirit of curiosity and the desire to search for truth and meaning. And as a child, I grew up with a friend with a similar spirit. She was my best friend, and she was also raised Unitarian Universalist. We met as toddlers. The freedom to search for truth and meaning allowed us to create a whole world of possibility. My best friend, she was from Galveston, Texas. My best friend had fair skin, brown hair, and green eyes. This was in the 1990s, when the Unitarian Universalist faith was heavily attended by and had a high membership of white women between 30 and 50 years old with at least a college education and who are married. Other than my mom being a recent divorcee, she fit the mold perfectly. When Megan and I were together, people's faces would light up. We didn't know what our appearance symbolized to the outside world. We just were happy to have someone to play with. As much as I loved my best friend, she also made me very jealous. When she'd come to visit and my mom would take us out, people would assume that Megan was my mother's daughter, not that I was. Very rarely did people think I was. And I must admit, there were times on occasion when someone would see my mom and myself out together that people would know that we were family. But in these instances, I wanted to know what was different. How come some people could see us as a family and others couldn't? And then I realized that the only people who commented, "Oh, is that your mother?" were people of color. The white people often saw a white woman with a black child. I love the skin that I'm in, don't get me wrong. It has not been an easy journey. What the free and responsible search for truth and meaning has given me the opportunity to do is dive into the racial divide that exists in my family history, my own identity. And I have been able to see that there are people within my family and within my faith community who have tried to heal this divide in countless ways. What is important is that I have a space to explore how my faith community has often been one of very few people of color, and what it feels like to be seen in those spaces versus being seen in a space where there are many black and brown and tan faces. I went to my first General Assembly when I was in my 20s. I was so excited. I had only visited a few other Unitarian Universalist faith groups, and as far as I was concerned, we were some mythical unicorn of the religious community. When I got into the GA, it was in this convention center. It was huge. And the first thing I thought was, oh my gosh, look at all these UUs. I had no idea there were so many. Then I took a closer look. I would say that the majority of the people at the conference looked like my mom. I found the young adults group in a room tucked away in the basement of the building and discovered that in that minority, there were even less people of color. So I went home with a heavy sadness. The sadness was that although I found my faith community, I did not find that many people who could connect to my experience as a person of color. I finally was put in touch with Reverend Elizabeth Nguyen, who brought a fire back into my spirit. She invited me to a racial justice retreat in New Orleans, Louisiana, for young adults. It was here that I met the biggest group of people of color who also identified as UUs. We unpacked so much of our identities that weekend, and we could do so with a sense of freedom and safety. I was able to meet people who also identified as mixed race, which I do. I could be in a space in which I wasn't presented with that societal trick question, what race are you? Oh, don't worry, one will be assigned to you. We all talked about stereotypes of race and what systems within our culture have oppressed us and created huge obstacles for us to connect with others and to achieve our dreams. It was one of the most magical weekends of my life. The free and responsible search for truth and meaning helped me to discover how to be strong and healthy as a person of color, knowing that people of color need to meet in covenant and support one another. We need to look at different racial identity models that are out there in the world and challenge them, because it's not one size fits all. We need to look into our gender and our sexual identity and see how it relates to racial justice. We need to stop being comfortable with discomfort. We need to do cultural work and examine our unexplored or even hidden histories. We need to be visible. And most importantly, we need to celebrate who we are.
Hello, all. In case we haven't met yet, my name is Maria Snyder. I am half Mexican on my mom's side and half English, Irish, German, French, Canadian on my dad's side. My parents divorced when I was 10, and they didn't get along, so I saw my dad and his family on rotating weekends and holidays. So I was mostly influenced by the Mexican side of my family and my predominantly Mexican neighborhood in Kansas City, where I grew up. Growing up, everybody that I knew was half something and half something else, including most of my family. So diversity and difference colored the way that I looked at the world. I originally came to Unitarian Universalism while looking for something to believe in. I'd had a crisis of faith, or 2 or 10, and many of my long-held beliefs were at odds with the lived experience that I was having and what I was witnessing in the world. Lots of questions were coming up for me, and while searching for the way each faith tradition tried to answer those questions, I was feeling more lost and more confused. So looking back, I realized a lot of that was because I was 20. And that's a totally normal way to feel. While discussing this search for something to believe in with a good friend of mine, they suggested that I already knew what I believed and that I should set out to find a religion that believed what I did. So I started searching the internet and came across a church that believed that all religious traditions contained some truth. I stumbled across Gaia Community, a UU pagan congregation in a Kansas City suburb. It was almost a year before I finally went. When I showed up at Gaia the first time, they showed me to Kids Space, where my kids were taught the value of living simply. I don't remember the service. I do remember that it was participatory. And I remember tearing up and realizing that for the first time, I had found a place that felt like home. This congregation attracts a very diverse group of people across ethnicities, ages, and socioeconomic classes, brought together by a desire to practice an earth-centered religion. Since then, I've moved to a new state every few years and attended UU services in each of the 7 states that I've lived. Every congregation has been very different, taking on the characteristics that reflect the local community. 10 years after my first UU experience, I delivered a very personal sermon to my small town Kansas congregation. followed by lots of uncomfortable small talk. My then girlfriend, now wife, pointed out that I was the only person of color there. I hadn't thought much about it at the time, but it ended up causing me some problems. During a discussion of how to attract people of color, I made some suggestions about possible speakers, possible topics, and diversifying the music. The response that I got was, "We don't want to make any of the members uncomfortable." The membership of this congregation was all white. The average income was upper middle class, and the average education was more than a graduate degree. This is not uncommon for UU congregations, but it was also not representative of the small Kansas town where this congregation lives. I had previously felt out of place. This experience amplified that feeling. Still, this religion was my truth, but my relationship with Unitarian Universalism was suddenly more complicated than it had been before. After that, I'd had a hard time speaking up and speaking out. I ultimately quit attending that church and found an Episcopal church to attend until I moved to my next city. In another UU congregation in Ohio, I was the only person of color to attend a workshop series about experiences on race. This time, while I was attending the workshop, I felt tokenized and policed several times by other attendees and ultimately quit attending. This time I didn't have the strength to tell them why, and I never went back. After 2 years of struggling to acclimate to life in New York City, I finally found my way here. I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to connect with anybody, but on my first visit, there was a meeting of the POC Affinity Group. This group of people were immediately welcoming, and after a couple of meetings, I felt seen and heard. I've been connecting with people of color who are sharing their truths in a space that is adding some depth and diversity to the messages that we hear on Sunday. The POC Affinity Group has provided a space that makes me feel more connected to the larger community at Fourth U, and they're healing my relationship with Unitarian Universalism.